In the heart of the old Kelwood forest, where the canopies were so thick that they could hold back the daylight, Sarah and her brother Mike decided to embark on a weekend camping trip. The forest was notorious locally, threaded with tales of eerie disappearances and unexplained phenomena that occurred under the cover of sudden, dense rainstorms. Despite the forewarnings from their neighbors, the thrill of an adventure and the lure of the untamed wilderness was too tantalizing for the siblings to resist. As they ventured deeper into the woods, the sky began to turn ominously gray, clouds swelling with an impending storm. Sarah, with her sharp instincts, felt a prickle of unease as the breeze turned colder, whispering through the trees like quiet murmurs of a gathering crowd. Their camp was set by a small, clear pond, the water as still as glass, reflecting the heavy, dark clouds above. They unpacked, setting up their small tent and gathering wood for a fire, all the while noticing how the normal sounds of wildlife were conspicuously absent. No birds chirped, and there were no rustlings of small animals in the underbrush, only the increasing moan of the wind and the distant rumble of thunder. As night fell and the first raindrops began to spatter against the nylon of their tent, Sarah tried to dismiss her brother's stories of the Kelwood forest, the tales of hikers who walked into the mist and never returned, the ghostly figures seen wandering through the storm, disoriented and calling for help. Mike, a fan of local lore, recounted them with a twinkle in his eye, embellishing each detail, enjoying the thrill it sent down their spines. The rain intensified, drumming a relentless, heavy beat on the forest floor, drowning out Mike's stories. The wind howled, bending trees until they groaned under the strain. Inside the tent, the siblings zipped into their sleeping bags, the light from their flashlights casting large, ominous shadows against the fabric walls. Trying to sleep through the storm was futile, each gust of wind felt like a harbinger of something sinister inching closer. Sometime past midnight, a sudden sharp snap, a loud breaking of branches, jolted Sarah awake. Her heart raced as she sat up, listening. The rain muffled all other sounds, but there was no mistaking the movement outside, the sound of footsteps, deliberate and heavy, circling their campsite. "Mike," she whispered urgently, shaking her brother. "Do you hear that?" Groggily, Mike unzipped his sleeping bag and listened. Another snap, closer this time, sent a shiver down his spine. Grabbing the flashlight, he hesitated, then slowly unzipped the tent flap. The beam of light cut through the darkness and rain, revealing only the drenched trees and bushes shaking in the wind. Nothing seemed amiss, but the feeling of being watched was undeniable. "Probably just a deer," Mike muttered, though his voice betrayed his uncertainty. They tried to settle back down, but the sounds continued, now joined by a low, mournful wail that seemed to rise with the wind. It was a human sound, a cry of despair that chilled them to the bone. Sarah and Mike huddled together, listening as the cries grew louder, more agonized. Unable to bear the terror any longer, Sarah decided they needed to leave, rainstorm or not. It was no longer safe. They hurriedly packed their essentials, the wailing growing ever closer, now punctuated by a strange, rhythmic chanting that neither could decipher. As they stepped out into the rain, the ground beneath their feet muddy and slick, they realized the forest around them had changed. The path they had followed into the campsite was gone, swallowed by the thick underbrush and the darkness. The familiar landmarks they had noted on their way in were obscured by the thick mist that seemed to rise from the very earth. Panic rose as they wondered, the wailing sounds surrounding them, as if coming from multiple directions. The forest seemed to close in, the trees now specters watching their desperate escape attempt. Just as they felt all hope was lost, a figure emerged from the mist, a tall, shadowy figure, its features blurred by the rain. Frozen, they watched as the figure beckoned them with a slow, deliberate motion. It was then that Sarah realized that the wailing had ceased, replaced by the heavy silence of the storm. The figure stood still, waiting, as if it held the answers to their escape or perhaps the entrance into a deeper nightmare. As the figure moved closer, its features became clearer, too clear for the comfort of the siblings, who stood rooted to the spot, too terrified to move. Figure's visage revealed itself not as a singular entity, but as a mosaic of faces, each twisted in agony, their eyes hollow pools reflecting the storm's fury. Sarah and Mike felt the air grow thick, the atmosphere charged with a palpable sense of dread. The figure's mouth opened wide, but instead of a scream, it let out a hollow, gusting wind that seemed to echo the cries of the forest itself. Driven by an instinctive fear, they turned to flee, but the forest around them had become an unrecognizable labyrinth of gnarled trees and shifting paths. The ground beneath their feet felt alive, roots and vines grasping at their ankles as they ran. The relentless rain turned the ground into a slippery mire that sucked at their boots, each step a monumental effort. Behind them, the figure's wail transformed into a chorus, a cacophony of voices that melded into a haunting melody. It was as if the forest itself had found a voice, a sorrowful lament for all those who had dared to trespass into its sacred depths. The sounds swirled around the siblings, disorienting them, leading them deeper into the darkness. As they pushed forward, the trees seemed to bend inward, forming narrow corridors that funneled them into an even deeper part of the forest. The sky was a mere memory here, the canopy so thick that not even the storm's fury could penetrate it fully. The only light was the occasional flash of lightning, revealing fleeting glimpses of the path ahead, twisted, gnarled limbs and faces embedded in the bark, watching, always watching. Hours seemed to pass as they stumbled through this nightmare landscape. Exhaustion began to take its toll, and Sarah's fear mingled with despair. Mike gripped her hand tighter, pulling her forward when her steps faltered, his own fear masked by the determination to protect his sister. Suddenly, the forest opened up into a clearing, dominated by an ancient, towering oak. Its branches stretched skyward like gnarled fingers, grasping at the hidden stars. At the base of the tree, a small, decrepit cabin sat, its windows dark, the door slightly ajar, swaying gently in the wind. The siblings exchanged a glance, a silent conversation of mutual reluctance and desperation. The cabin offered a possible refuge from the relentless pursuit, but at what cost? Their hearts pounded as they approached, the voices in the forest rising in a furious crescendo as if angered by their audacity to seek shelter. Mike pushed the door open, the hinges creaking ominously. Inside, the cabin was shrouded in shadows, the air stale and cold. They stepped inside, and Mike swung his flashlight around, the beam cutting through the darkness. The inside of the cabin was Spartan, with an old, dust-covered table, 2 chairs, and a fireplace that hadn't seen a fire in years. Old jars with indiscernible contents lined the shelves, and a thick layer of dust covered everything. As Sarah's eyes adjusted to the dim light, she noticed something odd about the walls. They were covered in carvings, intricate symbols that spiraled from floor to ceiling, weaving in and out of each other like a tapestry of madness. Mike moved closer, his flashlight tracing the lines. "These look like runes or some kind of ritualistic markings," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. Before Sarah could respond, a sudden gust of wind slammed the door shut behind them, plunging the cabin into darkness. The flashlight flickered and then died, leaving them in utter blackness. Their breaths came quick and fast, the silence oppressive. Then, from the darkness, a new sound emerged, a low, rhythmic thumping, like a heartbeat. It grew louder, more insistent, resonating through the cabin and into their very bones. Sarah felt the floor vibrate beneath her feet as if the cabin itself were alive. "Mike, what is that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know, but we need to find a way out," he replied, his voice steady despite the fear that gripped him. They fumbled in the dark, their hands searching for anything that might aid their escape. But as they moved, the cabin seemed to rearrange itself around them, the walls closing in, the room shrinking. The thumping grew louder, joined now by a whispering, a sibilant voice that slithered into their ears. "You cannot leave," the voice hissed, the words echoing around them. "You belong to the forest now." Frozen in fear, they realized the cabin was not a refuge but a trap, one more piece of the forest's twisted game. The realization sank in as the thumping crescendoed into a roar, the cabin shaking with the force of it. Outside, the storm raged on, oblivious to the horrors unfolding within. And as the siblings stood, trapped in the dark heart of the haunted cabin, they felt the very essence of the forest seeping into their souls, the dread and darkness intertwining with their deepest fears. The whispering grew into a cacophony of voices, each telling tales of sorrow and despair, of lost souls who wandered into the forest and never returned. The walls seemed to pulsate with the energy of the voices, the carvings glowing faintly with a ghostly light. Mike and Sarah clung to each other, their eyes wide with terror as they scanned the dimly lit confines for any sign of escape. But there was none. The door had vanished, replaced by solid wall, the windows mere impressions upon the wooden walls, no longer offering even the faintest glimmer of the outside world. They were trapped, encased in a living nightmare from which there seemed no escape. Suddenly, the floor beneath them began to shift, wooden planks curling up as if alive, forming a spiral pattern that rotated slowly. The heartbeat-like thumping synchronized with the movement of the floor, each beat a heavy thud that resonated through their bodies. Sarah felt a dizziness overcome her as the room spun, the walls closing in even tighter. Mike, desperate and terrified, shouted against the roar, "We need to think. There must be something, some way to break free." His voice was nearly drowned out by the continuing crescendo of thumps and the eerie, whispering voices. Sarah, her mind racing, recalled the old tales of the forest. The legend spoke of a heart, a core to the woods that held its power. Could this cabin be that heart? The epicenter of the forest's ancient and malevolent spirit? If so, perhaps disrupting this heart, this center, might offer them a chance. She relayed her thoughts to Mike, who nodded, his expression grim. But how? What can we do against this? He gestured around them at the supernatural forces encircling them. We disrupt the pattern. Sarah yelled back, her eyes catching the rhythmic movement of the floorboards. Help me. She dropped to her knees, trying to pry one of the moving planks up with her fingers. Mike joined her, and together they struggled against the wood, which seemed to fight back, resisting their efforts with a force that was almost sentient. Finally, with a loud crack, one plank came loose, revealing a dark, gaping hole beneath. The voices crescendoed in anger, the cabin shaking violently. A cold wind blasted up from the hole, carrying with it the stench of decay and a sound like a sigh from the depths of the earth. They peered down into the darkness, unable to see the bottom. We need to destroy this, Sarah said, her voice shaking but resolute. Whatever is down there, it's the key. Without hesitation, Mike began tearing at the other planks, enlarging the hole as the entire cabin seemed to wail in protest. The air grew colder, the whispering turning into screams of rage. As they exposed more of the dark void, Sarah searched the room for anything to use as a weapon. Her hand brushed against something cold and metallic on the shelf, a rusty old lantern with a small can of oil beside it. It was old and looked fragile, but it would have to suffice. She grabbed both and poured the oil into the lantern, lighting it with the last match trembling in her fingers. As the light flickered to life, casting eerie shadows on the twisted walls, she turned to Mike. Once I drop this, we run. Whatever happens, just run. With a nod of understanding, Mike braced himself. Sarah took a deep breath and, with a cry of defiance mixed with fear, threw the lantern into the gaping hole. The light descended into the darkness, a falling star in the depths of the earth, before crashing and igniting whatever lay below. An infernal roar erupted from the void, the ground shaking as flames burst forth, climbing the walls and enveloping the cabin. The screams of the forest reached a fever pitch, then abruptly cut off, leaving only the sound of crackling flames and collapsing timber. Grabbing Mike's hand, Sarah led the way as they sprinted toward where the door once stood. To their amazement and relief, it reappeared, swinging open to reveal the storm-battered forest outside. They did not look back as they ran out into the night, the cabin collapsing behind them in a fiery demise. Outside, the rain had lessened, and the once oppressive forest seemed strangely quiet, subdued. They ran without stopping, not daring to believe they might have escaped the nightmare, until the first rays of dawn began to break through the trees. Exhausted, soaked, and trembling, they emerged from the forest's edge, the morning light washing over them, feeling less like a victory and more like a reprieve. Behind them, the forest stood silent, its dark heart now a smouldering ruin, but the peace was tenuous. Sarah and Mike knew deep down that the forest's quiescence could be fleeting, the ancient energies that had thrived there might not be extinguished so easily. They staggered forward, away from the tree line, their bodies and spirits weighed down by the ordeal. The sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the landscape. Despite the light of day, the darkness of the night's events clung to them like a cold shroud. They found themselves on a familiar path, leading back to the main road, but every rustle in the underbrush, every whisper of the wind, sent jolts of fear through their tired bodies. As they walked, their conversation was sparse, each lost in their thoughts, processing the night's horrors. The physical distance from the forest did little to distance them from the memories of what had transpired. Their haunting wails, the sentient cabin, and the burning heart of the woods replayed in their minds, a loop of terror that neither silence nor speech could break. Finally reaching their car, which seemed an age since they had left it, they packed their muddy and wet gear into the trunk. Mike paused, his hand on the car door, looking back towards the forest. The line of trees stood eerily calm, the chaos of the night before like a distant dream. Yet, the tranquility seemed a deceitful veneer over a lingering malevolence. "We can't just leave it like this," Mike said, his voice carrying a mix of fatigue and resolve. "What if it's not over? What if it starts again?" Sarah leaned against the car, her eyes tired but determined. "Then we'll come back," she replied. "With more help. With people who can maybe understand or fight this thing. We can't let others wander into that without knowing, without warning." Their drive back to civilization was quiet, each mile taking them further away from the forest, but not from the shadow it cast over their spirits. The day passed, and as they entered the city, the normalcy of urban life felt jarring. People went about their daily routines, oblivious to the supernatural struggle that had unfolded just miles away. Once home, they took long showers, trying to wash away the grime and the fear. But as the water ran down the drain, so too did the reality sink in. They had survived, yes, but at what cost? And what of the forest's dark heart? Was it truly destroyed, or merely dormant? As night approached, the siblings found sleep elusive. The sounds of the city were a poor substitute for the oppressive silence they had endured in the woods. Lying in their beds, the echoes of the forest's cries mingled with the urban night sounds, a dissonant symphony that kept the terror fresh in their minds. In the early hours, when the world is at its quietest, Sarah's phone rang. The screen showed a number she didn't recognize. With a hesitant hand, she answered. "Hello." Her voice was groggy with sleep. The line crackled, and a voice, strained and urgent, spoke. "Is this Sarah?" Sarah, who was just at Kelwood Forest. "Yes," she replied, a knot forming in her stomach. "Who is this?" "My name is Dr. Elias Hart. I'm a researcher, specialized in paranormal activities and ancient folklore. I heard about your encounter in the forest. You and your brother may have stirred something that was not meant to be disturbed." Sarah sat up, her heart rate accelerating. "What do you mean?" "We destroyed the heart of the forest." There was a pause, and when Dr. Hart spoke again, his voice was grave. "You might have stopped it temporarily, but such forces aren't destroyed easily. They are part of a larger cycle, one that has been disturbed now. I need to meet with you and your brother as soon as possible." The call ended with arrangements to meet the following day. Sarah lay back, staring at the ceiling. The forest had reached out, beyond its physical bounds, drawing them back into its dark fold. The thought of returning filled her with dread, but also a resolute need to face whatever awaited them. Morning found Sarah and Mike at a small cafe, waiting for Dr. Hart. The city buzzed around them, a stark contrast to the looming discussion of otherworldly forces. When Dr. Hart arrived, his appearance was as expected of someone who chased shadows, a mix of academic dishevelment and keen intensity. As they talked, the sun rose higher, casting light on the hidden corners of the world, but none strong enough to penetrate the deep, dark woods of Kelwood Forest. The story of the forest was not over, it was just beginning, and Sarah and Mike were now inextricably part of it, drawn into a narrative that was as ancient as the forest itself. Dr. Hart laid out a collection of old maps and photocopied pages from obscure texts across the cafe table. Each document was marked with notes and symbols that seemed as cryptic as the carvings in the cabin. He pointed to a map showing the Kelwood Forest area, his finger tracing lines that formed a complex pattern. "These are ley lines," Dr. Hart explained, his voice low to avoid attracting attention from other cafe patrons. "They are alignments across the landscape believed to carry spiritual or cosmic energy. It appears Kelwood Forest is a nexus point for several of these lines, which could explain the concentration of paranormal activity." Sarah and Mike listened, absorbing the gravity of his words. The notion that they had inadvertently tapped into a power much greater and more ancient than they had imagined was daunting. "Your actions in the forest," Dr. Hart continued, "may have temporarily disrupted whatever entity resides there, but such beings are often bound to these lines. It could be gathering strength, preparing to restore its influence." Mike leaned forward, his face tense with concern. "So what do? We can't just let it build up power again." "That's precisely why I contacted you," Dr. Hart said. "I've been studying phenomena like this for years, but this is the first time I've encountered something so potent. We need to go back, investigate further, and if possible, seal the entity or at least curb its ability to harm." Sarah felt a chill despite the warm sun streaming through the cafe windows. "Go back," she echoed, her voice tinged with fear, but also determination. "Isn't that dangerous?" "Extremely," Dr. Hart admitted, his eyes not wavering from hers. "But with the right preparations and understanding more about what we're dealing with, we stand a chance. I have contacts who can help, people who have dealt with similar situations." The decision to return to Kelwood Forest felt both foolhardy and inevitable. They agreed to gather more information and prepare thoroughly before venturing back into the woods. Over the next few days, their lives became a whirlwind of research and planning. Dr. Hart introduced them to a small team of experts, including an anthropologist, a medium, and an ex-military survivalist. Each team member brought a unique skill set crucial for facing the unknown dangers of the forest. They met regularly, discussing strategies and sharing insights into the supernatural and discussing protective measures. Meanwhile, the atmosphere around Kelwood Forest grew increasingly tense. Local news reported more frequent wildlife disturbances and an unseasonable chill that settled over the area. The town's edge closest to the forest saw a few nights undisturbed by inexplicable shadows and fleeting apparitions. The community, once skeptical, began to fear that the legends of the forest were more fact than folklore. As the day of their return approached, the weather turned sour, mirroring the dark mood that hung over their preparations. The team gathered at the forest's edge just before dawn, under a brooding sky, the air thick with the scent of an impending storm. Dr. Hart briefed them once more, his voice steady despite the ominous setting. "Stay close, keep communication lines open, and remember, everything we do today must be in unison. We're not just dealing with natural elements, but something that transcends them." With every step into the forest, the weight of their task seemed to grow heavier. The trees stood like silent sentinels, the wind whispering through the leaves carrying echoes of the past terror. The team moved with purpose, their equipment humming and clicking as they measured, recorded, and observed every anomaly. Hours passed as they trekked deeper into the heart of the woods, following the map Dr. Hart had prepared. They reached the burnt-out remains of the cabin by midday, the site now nothing more than a blackened scar on the earth. The ground was still barren, the air around it colder than the surrounding forest. "This is the place," Dr. Hart confirmed, checking his instruments. "The energy readings are off the charts." They began setting up their equipment, forming a perimeter around the site. The medium, a quiet woman named Elise, began to chant softly, her words a mixture of an ancient language and a forceful command. The wind picked up, swirling around the clearing, her voice rising over the growing howl. Sarah and Mike exchanged a nervous glance as the sky darkened, clouds rolling in rapidly. The forest seemed to respond to Elise's chanting, the air vibrating with energy. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the forest, a sound so powerful it felt as if the earth itself had split. From the center of the clearing, where the cabin once stood, a brilliant light burst forth, casting an eerie glow over everything. The team froze, transfixed by the sight. The light pulsed, rhythmically at first, then began to expand, forming a shimmering barrier that slowly enveloped the entire area, creating an otherworldly dome of ethereal energy. As the barrier grew, the natural sounds of the forest muted, replaced by a resonating silence that seemed to press in on their ears. The light from the barrier cast ghostly shadows across their faces, making the scene appear as if they had stepped into a realm not of this world. Dr. Hart monitored the readings on his equipment, his expression growing increasingly grim. "The energy is stabilizing, but it's not resolving," he muttered, adjusting the dials on his device. "It's forming a containment field, but whatever is inside is still active, possibly gaining strength." The team members looked to one another, uncertainty and fear mingling in their eyes. Sarah, gripping her brother's hand tightly, watched as the medium, Elise, stepped closer to the barrier. Her eyes were closed and she moved rhythmically, as if in a trance, her chants growing louder. "Elise is trying to communicate with the entity," explained Dr. Hart. "To understand its nature and potentially pacify it." The air within the barrier shimmered, and a low hum began to resonate, a sound that felt as if it could resonate with their very bones. Suddenly, Elise's body stiffened, and her chanting ceased abruptly. She opened her eyes, which glowed momentarily with an unnatural light. "It speaks of ancient wrongs, of bindings broken and territories invaded," she said in a voice that was not entirely her own. "It is bound to this land, an old guardian of forgotten lore, and it will not rest while trespassers roam." Her words sent a shiver down the spines of everyone present. Mike looked around, the forest now seeming more like a cage than a haven. "So, what can we do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "We negotiate," said Dr. Hart firmly. "We must offer it something to appease its unrest, or we reinforce the containment until we can find a more permanent solution." The discussion was cut short as the barrier pulsed again, more violently this time. The ground trembled, and a series of eerie lights began to flicker within the dome, dancing like will-o'-the-wisps, leading them deeper into an unknown mystery. "Prepare yourselves," Dr. Hart announced, as he pulled a series of talismans from his bag, handing them out to each team member. "These are protective charms, based on the old rites believed to ward off malevolent spirits. They might give us more leverage." As they each took a talisman, securing them around their necks, Sarah felt a new weight settle around her heart. This was no longer just about survival, it was about understanding a piece of hidden history, about coexisting with a force beyond their previous comprehension. The sky above darkened as clouds rolled in, threatening a storm that mirrored their fraught emotions. Lightning flashed, casting stark light on the barrier, which now throbbed with a steady, ominous glow. "Whatever happens next," Dr. Hart said, looking each of them in the eye, "remember that we're not just dealing with myths or stories. We're standing at the crossroads of history and the unknown. Our actions today will resonate far beyond these woods. With a collective nod, the team prepared to engage further with the entity, each aware of the potential consequences. The barrier's glow intensified, beckoning them to step closer, to enter into a dialogue with the ancient guardian of Kelwood Forest. As they moved forward, the wind picked up, whipping around them as if to echo the rising tension. Inside the barrier, the light swirled faster, creating a hypnotic display that was both terrifying and mesmerizing. The story of their encounter with the deep woods was far from over. As they stood on the brink of discovery, or perhaps disaster, the line between their world and the old powers blurred. What lay ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: the forest held secrets that were now demanding to be heard, and Sarah, Mike, and their companions were right at the heart of the unfolding mystery, ready to face whatever came next. As the team edged closer to the pulsing barrier, the storm above reached its crescendo. Thunder rumbled like the angry growls of the earth itself, and lightning illuminated the forest in stark, ghostly flashes. The air was electric, charged with both the storm's natural fury and the supernatural energy emanating from the barrier. Dr. Hart signaled for everyone to stop just outside the reach of the light's dance. "This is as close as we go without an invitation," he whispered, his eyes locked on the swirling lights within the barrier. Elise, still connected in some ethereal way to the entity, nodded slowly, her face pale but composed. "Let me speak," she said, her voice carrying a strength that belied her slight frame. Stepping forward, she raised her hands towards the barrier, her words cutting through the noise of the storm. "Guardian of the forest, hear us. We come not as conquerors, but as seekers of knowledge and peace." The air within the barrier stilled, the light slowing their frenetic dance as if listening. A silence fell over the forest, the storm's rage quieting momentarily, holding its breath. Then a voice, deep and resonant, seemed to emanate from the very ground beneath their feet. "Long have I guarded these lands against those who would take and destroy. Many have come, few have understood. Why should you be any different?" Elise responded, her voice clear and unwavering. "Because we acknowledge your pain and the wrongs of the past. We offer respect and seek understanding. We wish to learn, not to exploit." The lights flickered, softening in color, turning from harsh white to a gentle blue. The voice spoke again, this time softer, a note of curiosity threading through the ancient timbre. "And what would you offer in exchange for this understanding?" Dr. Hart stepped forward, holding up a small, intricately carved stone. "We offer this artifact, returned from where it was taken many generations ago. It belongs here, with you, as a gesture of our sincerity." The ground trembled as the artifact was carefully placed on the edge of the barrier. The blue light enveloped the stone, examining it, feeling its history. After a moment, the light expanded, enveloping the team in a warm glow. The voice, now almost gentle, filled the air. "The artifact has been accepted. The understanding begins." As the barrier's glow enveloped them, each team member felt a profound peace, a connection to the forest and its guardian that transcended time. They knew this was only the beginning of a long journey of discovery and reconciliation, a journey that would require more sacrifices and wisdom. The storm resumed its cacophony, but the barrier remained, a beacon of gentle blue light in the dark forest. As they prepared to leave, each team member took one last look back. The forest no longer seemed menacing or forbidding, but rather a sacred place, alive with history and spirit. They left the clearing under the protection of the Guardian's light, making their way back through the now calm woods. The path was clear, the oppressive fear lifted. They knew they would return, but next time, not as intruders, but as allies. The story of their encounter with the deep woods of Kelwood and its ancient guardian would live on, a tale of respect, understanding, and coexistence between the human and the supernatural. It was a reminder that some mysteries were not meant to be conquered, but understood and preserved. As the forest faded into the background, so too did the glow of the barrier, but its light remained in their hearts, a lasting beacon in the dark.